I'm Steve Wilkerson, and I'm with David Royse, Executive Editor of the News Service of Florida. David, elections supervisors are in the capital city this week. What are they advocating?
Well, they are saying that the legislature needs to make changes to the way elections are run in order to fix some of the problems that we saw in November. The supervisors of elections, remember there's 66 elected election supervisors. There's 67 counties, but Miami-Dade doesn't have an elected supervisor. She's appointed by the county government there. But anyway, the election supervisors, of course, are independently elected around the state, most of them. And so, but they have to follow the laws that the legislature passes, and some of those laws made it difficult to conduct an election. They said one of the things that's come up, they would like to see a return to more early voting. We pretty much knew this was going to come up ever since Election Day lines lasted 5, 6, 7 hours for some people in some parts of the state. People said, well, you see, we warned you that if you reduce the number of early voting hours, people would spend more hours waiting online on Election Day, and that is what happened, although the correlation is not certain. It is the case that we went from 14 days to 8 days, and lo and behold, there were longer lines.
Did the supervisors object to the legislation that resulted in these long lines?
Well, first of all, let's not make the automatic jump that the legislation resulted directly in these long lines.
Right,
although there are a lot of people who will say that.
Okay.
But the election supervisors certainly warned that among the changes, including reducing the early voting days, that the whole of the changes would result in longer lines. Several of them, in fact, I recently went back and looked at some of the newspaper stories from before the election, and there were several that quoted election supervisors saying, you know, we're going to have problems on Election Day. The long lines was one of the issues, the early voting was one of the issues. But the other that was prominently mentioned was the length of the ballot. We had a really long ballot in most of the state. Now, it's different from county to county because different local governments are able to put referenda on the ballot that obviously would change from locale to locale, and also the number of local officials up for re-election might be different from place to place. So the range of the length of the ballot was pretty wide. It was 4 pages in some places. In Miami-Dade County, it was 12 pages. We wrote a story last week where we quoted Senate President Don Gates saying that the ballot in Miami-Dade County read like the book of Leviticus, although maybe not quite as interesting. And the length of the ballot, several election supervisors warned beforehand that that was going to be a problem, that people were going to take a long time to read through that thing.
And a lot of the length was due to proposed constitutional amendments placed there by the legislature.
That's right. 11 constitutional amendments were on the ballot this year. All of them put there by the legislature, not through the initiative process. Already we're starting to hear that maybe that's something that ought to be looked at. In fact, Governor Rick Scott has already said that he wants lawmakers to look at the early voting issue, maybe contemplate adding days of early voting, which, you know, they just took them away in the most recent, a couple of years ago. And he wants them to look at the length of the ballot. And there are a couple other things, like giving the supervisor of elections more flexibility in determining how many actual voting machines at each polling site and where they are and things. But this ballot length issue is fascinating. As far as the number of constitutional amendments, already a proposed constitutional amendment, ironically, has been filed to try to limit the number of proposed constitutional amendments legislators could put on the ballot to 3 in a given election. As you said, there were 11 this past year. We'll see if that goes over with lawmakers.
Let's just talk about that for a minute. Why not 5?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer. Senator Jeff Clemens filed this bill, and again, it's a proposed constitutional amendment. It means they got to get 60% of the legislature to agree with it, and then 60% of voters. And then, going forward, legislators would only be able to put 3 of those questions on the ballot. I haven't spoken to Senator Clemens, and I don't know what led him to settle on 3. But there has been some research about how long it takes people to read through these things. And generally people on some of these longer ballot questions, people can spend several minutes on these things. Another thing that's come up is the length of the ballot questions themselves. Something that a lot of people probably don't know is that the legislature a few years ago, put a limit on the length of the summary, the ballot summary, when interest groups get, they go through the initiative process, they get signatures, they get something on the ballot. There is a limit, a 75-word limit on the length of the ballot summary. But the legislators exempted themselves from that, and they don't have to abide by that. And pretty sure most people would say that the reason is the legislature has constantly fought with the courts over the language in those ballot summaries. The Supreme Court has thrown out several proposed constitutional amendments because the legislature hasn't been able to come up with a ballot summary that the court said fairly summarized the actual change in the Constitution they were proposing. So one of the things they did was they said, well, we won't put a summary in there. In some cases, if it's complicated, we just put the whole ballot, question in there.
So they gave themselves more leeway, more words to summarize their amendment.
And in some cases in this past election, they did actually put the entire proposed constitutional amendment on the ballot, which was, in some cases a pretty long read, and it's full of legalese. It's pretty technical, and when you just go into the voting booth and you just look at it, it's daunting. I mean, I didn't want to read some of those things, and I follow this stuff regularly. The average person who has to slog through some sort of property tax amendment that's several paragraphs long and includes several really long words, it is a bit daunting. And I think there is a developing consensus that maybe shortening the ballot, the length of the actual proposed amendments might be something that legislators ought to look at. And I think they will. I also think there may not be a consensus to return early voting days. After all, Republicans just shortened the number of early voting days, and most political scientists say early voting has generally helped Democrats. So Republicans don't want to necessarily add voting days. But I think I'm starting to get a sense that they might. They're certainly going to, there's already a bill filed by Republican Senator Miguel Diaz de la Portilla to add one early voting day to go from 8 to 9, but it's a critical early voting day. It's the Sunday before Election Day. That wasn't allowed last time, and Democrats say that's a big day, especially for African-American churches, get people out to the polls. So they want that day back, and a Republican senator has already proposed that. They're also, Republicans in the legislature, oddly, are being pushed along by their own Republican governor. Governor Rick Scott was the first one to say, maybe we made a mistake here and we need to go back and add more voting days, which is pretty extraordinary.
Why? I mean, is this one of those issues that is just somehow gaining some grassroots support and support from the media, and Republicans are saying, hey, we need to do this?
I think so. I think that's the issue. I think there is a chorus of I think, for one, voters, not necessarily all of the Republicans' constituents, but remember, we just redrew the districts. So there are some districts where Republican legislators are going to have a fair number of. There's some pretty competitive districts, more so than there used to be, and I think there is a sense from among Republicans that there's this hue and cry that there may have been a problem. I mean, it's not just voters, but when you get the election supervisors, when you get the establishment, the political establishment saying, hey, something went wrong, let's figure out what it was, and you go to the election supervisors who are closest to whatever happened, and they say, you shouldn't have taken away these early voting days, please give us some back. I think there's some sense that maybe they ought to listen to them. The question is, how far are they going to go, and I don't know the answer to that.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
For more breaking news about Florida politics and government, visit the Advances section of our website.